This is the Granite Beat, a podcast where we highlight New Hampshire journalists, ask them about recent stories they've published, and about what it's like to cover their corner of this small and interesting state. I'm Julie Hart, and I'm here with Adam Drapcho.
Hello.
Our guest today is David Brooks, also known as the Granite Geek, which is the title of the column he writes for the Concord Monitor. David has been a columnist since 1991 and has been awarded by organizations from the New Hampshire Press Association to the NH Farm Bureau. Thank you for joining us, David.
My pleasure.
David, could you describe for us the path that took you to journalism? What attracted you to the industry, and how'd you break in?
Obviously, what attracted me to the industry was the comics page of the newspaper as a kid. I think that's fairly common, at least for my age group, maybe not kids today. And reading the listing of hit songs from the local AM radio stations when the Beatles were being big, So I like newspapers. And of course, the Vietnam War was going, so there was always stuff in the news. And my dad was in the military. So I had an interest in newspapers growing up. I got my bachelor's degree in mathematics, another interest, but there's not much you can do with a bachelor's degree in mathematics. You really need advanced degrees, which was over my head. So I sort of fell back on newspapers as a default. And my first job in a newspaper was typesetting, that I just took it to make some money and to see what a newspaper was like. Well, I found out what I wanted to do in life. It was a small daily, and when they had an opening for a reporter, I was able to sort of weasel my way into the newsroom, and that's how I got started. And that was 3 years ago. And I've worked for daily newspapers ever since. Tennessee, I grew up in Virginia, Tennessee, West Virginia, and then up in New Hampshire. I've been in New Hampshire for 30 some odd years. I was 28 years at the Nashua Telegraph, and I've been 7 years now at the Concord Monitor. Almost always as roughly a general assignment reporter with an emphasis on technology, science, business. I spent a few years on the copy desk.
Your voice today seems to be part reporter, part columnist. Can you tell me how you developed that voice?
Yeah, so actually I started writing columns. So when I was at the Nashua Telegraph, the Sunday paper had launched just a couple years before, and one of the things they had inside one of the sections was a sci-tech page, and it was just wire copy. And I said, this, and when I moved to the copy desk, I said, this is interesting. Can I do stuff with this? And when you're in the newsroom, you're surrounded by English majors, right? And so none of them wanted to do anything with a sci-tech page. So I got to play with it, and part of playing was I started writing little briefs that to fill space. If any of you have ever been on a newspaper copy desk, you know that there's always little holes that have to be filled, and that just turned into a column that I wrote mostly to entertain myself, and it's sort of kept from there. So writing a column, and you're right, about 2/3 of what I do is straight reporting. 1/3 is column kind of voice. Writing a column in many ways is much easier because you can fill in the gaps yourself without having to find a source to give you information. A lot of times when you're a reporter, you know something is true, you know the facts, but you need to find a source to say it and put it in the story. And that's time consuming. And then when you're a columnist, you can just say it yourself. So in many ways, writing a column is easier. Reporting a column is easier. Let me put it that way. Frequently, writing it may or may not be easier. I've developed, quote, a voice over time just by, I've written thousands of them. I once calculated how many words I'd written, on various estimates. It was well over 5 million, and I got depressed, so I stopped.
Wow.
Do you have a favorite word?
Me. That's my favorite word. Me.
Good one. How do you go about deciding what to write about for your columns?
Again, this is where columns are easier. I write about what interests me. I mean, obviously, that's a slight exaggeration for effect. It needs to have I have to feel that it has some impact or some interest to the outside world. But there are things I write about that are only of interest to me. And the classic example being culverts. I've written about culverts a lot. Culverts are awesome. So, and in the process of writing about them, I think I've made some readers understand that they're important. They're a signifier of climate change's effect on our infrastructure. Because when you get extreme rains, they wash out a culvert, and all of a sudden you can't drive down that road anymore. that thing you've never noticed before is suddenly very important. But they're small enough that they can be sort of understood as compared to, big sweeping infrastructure bills or something. So I write about things that interest me. I mean, this week's column is about there are a couple of nonprofit avalanche groups in the Mount Washington Valley join, which is, really boring. Who cares about organizations joining together? So I used it as an excuse to talk about how climate change is making avalanche forecasting more difficult and what that might mean for people like me who hike. So I'm driven largely I had the luxury of being driven largely by my own personal interest.
Many writers who have been in the game for many years have developed a relationship of sorts with their readers, but you've taken it a step further by hosting monthly Science Cafe meetings. Could you tell us how and when that started, what that's like, and how it has fostered a connection between you and your audience?
Sure. So let me have a proviso, though. Since COVID, we stopped them, and I have not started them up again up in Concord. They are operating in Nashville, but let me step back. So 11 years ago or something, I was approached by a couple of people who wanted to start a science cafe. That's a monthly discussion in a bar or a restaurant about some topic that would have more of a science and technology bent, sort of, like a book group, except it's about sciencey stuff. And they exist all in many parts of the world, and there's a number of them around the U.S. And they basically wanted me to get involved, partly because, I was obvious, and partly because I'd give them free publicity in the newspaper. And I said that was a great idea. I'd been looking for something like that. My wife and I, our kids were growing up and leaving the house, and my wife and I were looking for stuff to do, and that was exactly this sort of thing I was looking for. So we started it down in Nashua. It got popular enough that when I moved to the Monitor, I started it up here in Concord, and other people took it over in Nashua as well. So we had two of them going. Since then, the Sea Science Museum in Manchester has started one. They're still going strong down in downtown at one of the bars in Manchester. There's been one out on the seacoast that has started and stopped. There's one in Keene. You choose a topic, you find a couple people to answer questions about it, and people come into the bar or the restaurant and ask them questions for a couple hours. It's very casual. My role was always as moderator and publicist, obviously. And definitely, you're right. I met people who were already readers of the column or of the newspaper, or who became readers of the column of the newspaper. In 2006, I started a blog back when blogs were cool, and it's also a newsletter now.
I imagine it has changed the way some of your readers engage with your work. Has it changed the way that you do your work at all?
No, the Science Cafe hasn't really. The Science Cafe to me is very much like reporting for a story. Is you get a couple of experts on a topic and you ask them questions and you think about what they've said. It doesn't require the last step, which is organizing it into a story. But otherwise, it's very similar to doing the reporting I do all the time, which is one of the reasons it was fairly easy for me to become a moderator and to organize it for so long. The thing that has changed reporting more is the blog and newsletter. And as a sort of a spin-off from that would be social media, because that's lots of smaller, all the time items as compared to, once a week big column or twice a week big column. And that's somewhat a different approach, much more, for me anyway, and I think for most people, it's much more casual, much more conversational than when you're, putting words in print on paper or in a formal blog underneath a masthead. In a formal newspaper underneath a masthead. As you could, the Granite Geek blog. Until, for example, today I just put up the column, today's column from the Monitor, which is about the avalanche and the climate change. And, the Monitor had a newspaper kind of headline on it. And so my headline for the blog was, climate change ruins everything, chapter MCMX LVII, the avalanche edition, which is not something you'd put in a newspaper. So that has been more of a change than Science Cafe, actually. So.
How about the newspaper landscape overall? How have you seen that? How have you seen that landscape change? And do you feel that the role of columnist has changed with it?
Newspaper landscape. This is where you do the sad trombone noise, because of course it's declined precipitously since I started. I mean, I was of the generation that came in right after Watergate that was all excited about newspapers, and they were doing everything. And the local news really peaked around probably about the millennium in terms of a business and in terms of staffing and in terms of sort of the reach and importance. And I'm talking again about print journalism, newspapers in particular. And it's declined precipitously then. And you go down to the newsroom in the New Hampshire State House used to be just packed. There wasn't enough room for it. People would fight over who got the desk. And now it's a post-apocalyptic wasteland. There just aren't that many staffers. And frankly, if you'd asked me this question 6-7 years ago, I'd have said it's doomed. There just isn't enough money to support local journalism in the old business ecosystem, which is advertising and subscriptions. Advertising is gone. It's all gone to Google and Facebook and Twitter and whatever. And there just isn't enough money in subscriptions to support what you and I think of as standard local journalism. However, in the last 3 or 4 years, really, and New Hampshire's really seen this, there's been a growth in non-traditional local journalism. And I'm thinking of like Report for America, which is a national nonprofit that pays roughly half the salary of a reporter, sticks them in local newsrooms. There's conditions and all that. And we have a couple of them right now. So it's increased the newsroom staff at the Monitor by a sizable extent. There's some nonprofits. The New Hampshire Bulletin is the classic example. It started up 3 years ago, with a couple of very, very experienced journalists, and has done great work. And doesn't have a corporate overlord and doesn't sell ads. It's a different thing. Vermont has a couple of statewide nonprofits, Vermont Digger and 7 Days, that are pretty experienced, pretty established. So I'm much more hopeful for that local journalism will continue, even though the private commercial model is not succeeding.
We should mention the New Hampshire, the Granite State News Collaborative, which is responsible for this podcast as well.
Exactly, and that's an interesting one because its function is almost like what AP was. The News Collaborative, AP, Associated Press, back before it cratered, because it was supported by payments from newspapers like ours and others. And we still pay it, but we pay it mostly for, I believe, the national sports wire is really all we use from it. But part of what it did was it gathered together stories from member organizations and made them accessible to each other, which is what the News Collaborative has done. And that's great. I mean, that's awesome. There's no reason why a story written in Keene has to, can't be read by somebody in the Seacoast or in the North Country or Concord. So, no, you're right. I should have mentioned the Collaborative. It's another example of non-traditional. There's like Manchester Inklink and In-Depth NH. Those are both nonprofits, independent, started by former journalists, former newspaper people, I believe, all of them. Experienced journalists who were frustrated by, all the layoffs. So it's great.
I enjoyed a recent column you wrote about deer hunting. I'd like to use that as an example to kind of get a closer look at how you do your work. Could you tell me how you got onto that topic? How did you go about investigating it, and what did you learn?
Okay, sure. I'm not a hunter, so I'll start out with that. I'm happy to have hunters. So I got onto it because I've written about hunting every year. Hunting is the start of hunting season, in particular deer season in the fall. It's a big event in New Hampshire that you mention at least or write about just because it's a big event in New Hampshire. I mean, it's like, the presidential primary or something. Hundreds on opening day, opening weekend of rifle season, of firearm season. There's well over 1,000 people out in the woods. So you write about it. You're interested journalistically just because it's a thing in the community, right? So I'd written about that for years and various news aspects of it. Things like that. And the bigger story has been the continuing decline in the number of hunters as urbanization and other aspects happen. I've written that story many times over the years. Sub stories, of which the coolest, the one you probably know about, is the return of wild turkeys. So
Yes.
they were pretty much wiped out. They were wiped out in New Hampshire, and they were brought back in the 70s. That didn't work. They came back in the 80s, and they got established, and now they're everywhere, right? So that's a cool story. So basically, I was thinking, hey, fall's coming. I should write about. And let me just say, part of the reason I think we write about it, a lot of our readers are suburbanites and don't hunt, is to remind them, hey, this thing happens. This is a thing in the state that's important to the state that you may not know about. So it's almost a reminder story. Sort of like maple syrup season, right? You may not go out to a syrup house, but doggone it, it's part of New Hampshire. So I was thinking about it, and I made a joke on Twitter about, geez, I wish I had hunters coming to my property because the blankety blank deer keep eating they eat all the peaches off my tree. They're stealing all the dropped apples that I usually grab from applesauce. And somebody responded saying, well, actually, I'm looking for somewhere to hunt. And so she was going to come to my property, and she came, and turns out she's a food writer for the Washington Post who lives in Cape Cod, and she had been hunting on a farm that the guy did, for various reasons, that wasn't available, and so she was looking for somewhere to hunt. So she came out here, and we stomped around the property and looked for good places where she could set up. As it turns out, she had to cancel last minute because of, actually, I think she had to do a podcast.
Oh, sure. Blame it on the podcast.
Blame it on a stupid podcast. Anyway, so those darn deer are still rampaging around because of podcasts. So that gave me a hook, right? Here's a hook. I'm not a hunter, but I want a hunter. And then she had written column about how venison is the most eco-friendly of meats if you hunt it yourself. And I absolutely agreed. And I'd sort of mentioned that in past stories, but I thought I'd use that as the hook and use her as the hook about it. And so that's what the column was about, saying, if what's the most eco-friendly food? You can go out in the woods and pluck mushrooms, but you're removing something from the environment that's good. But if you go out and you shoot a deer around here, in southern New Hampshire in particular, the deer, there's way too many of them, and they're really damaging to the ecosystem. They really are altering our forests because they eat all the seedlings before they can sprout. There are, I know Harvard Forest down in Massachusetts, an experimental forest, is doing fencing to see how the ecosystem works if you can keep all the deer out. It's a radical difference. So they're kind of an invasive species, even though they're native. So killing them off is actually making the ecosystem better. So when you're getting your meat, but you're also improving the environment in a very small way. So that was kind of the essence of the column. So, go ahead.
One thing that was sparked my interest. One reason I wanted to ask you about that story or that column is because I know that from my own past in working in newspapers, some of the most vigorous responses we've gotten from our readers is when we've suggested that hunting is a thing that people do and it's a valued part of our culture, and particularly if we have put a picture of a harvested animal in the paper. We've gotten some really I'll say spirited responses from our readers. I'm wondering, did you get any feedback on that particular column?
So I braced myself for it, figured some of our liberal, crunchy granola readers would react. And I only got one, much to my surprise. And I got several from hunters saying, golly, thank you for writing that.
Okay.
So I've had the experience you have in particular. You're right. So we did not have a picture of a dead deer hanging from a hook at the harvesting station. So that probably would have added to it, but it could easily have happened. There is a large number of people who don't want to be reminded of the fact that when they eat a hamburger, there was a live animal part of it at one point, and they're offended that you would. My child doesn't want to eat a hot dog anymore because you told him it used to be a pig. And I said, well, such is life, my friend.
So we're at a time of great change in the local media landscape. You already mentioned the development of these not-for-profit organizations and how they've changed the scene here. I'm wondering, though, as someone who focuses a lot on technology, how do you see technology interacting with the way that we share news today, and particularly what's your forecast for how that might further develop in the future?
Well, since I've been so staggeringly incorrect for years about this, I'm not sure I do any flip anymore. But let me step back slightly and say I actually think one of the things that's happened in the last couple of years is that people have, even the general public, has come to value the idea of local news a little more, even though they still, they get mad at their local paper because it, misspelled their kid's name in the sports section or something. But so I actually think there's somewhat of a groundswell of people who are interested in the idea of local news still existing. Technology is not entirely friendly to that. So I'm old enough that I was around when the internet started, and one time I had 5 email addresses at the Telegraph. I was the first guy with an email address at the Telegraph as part of the paper.
No kidding.
Back in the day when you had CompuServe address and an AOL address and a Genie address and stuff again. Anyway, and we thought it was going to be. It was going to be awesome. We were going to make just as much money from ads, and yet we were going to spend less on circulation, and we were going to be rolling in it, and that didn't work out too well. And the saying was you traded advertising dollars in print for advertising dimes on the website, and that's been traded for advertising pennies on mobile with your phone. Phones, are great for scrolling, are great for quick hits, are great for zipping through a whole lot of stuff fast. I don't think they're very good for actual journalism. Having said that, I didn't grow up with one. And you ask a 20-year-old who's never seen life without everybody having a phone, there may not be as much of an issue for them. So I am unclear as to whether if most people transition entirely to the equivalent of their phone and mobile devices, what local journalism will look like in that format. It can't just be social media of people sharing stuff, because there has to be stuff to share. And most of reporting is kind of dull and time consuming, and nobody's going to do it unless you're paid to some extent. And how that will fit into, a TikTok world, you need to ask somebody with less gray hair than me.
Well, thank you. Julie, do you have any questions for David?
I do. I have a question. What advice would you give to people who are interested in entering the world of journalism from your experience?
My experience is almost entirely irrelevant in terms of building a career anymore in journalism, because it has changed so much. No, seriously, this comes up all the time. And so one of the great things about working for a newspaper or any news organization is, at least up until now, you've had a mix of experiences. So there's me and a couple other guys. They're all males, it turns out, roughly my age. We talk about grandkids and reminisce about having 5 email addresses. And then there's a bunch of 20-somethings reporters who are fairly new and who run circles around us, certainly energetically and with new ideas. And that's a great mix. You don't want nothing but 20-somethings, and you don't want nothing but 50-somethings. You really want a little homogeneity, if I pronounce that right. So, but part of that is what's your advice? And 15 years ago, I had great advice on how to build a career in journalism, but that doesn't really work anymore. Start at the local paper and then work up to the regional paper, and then, do some freelancing for a magazine on the side. I will say that being a reporter of any kind for any organization is an awesome job. I mean, it's just so much fun. It's like you get to stick your nose in other people's business. If you think it's interesting, it's you walk down the street and you say, "Gee, I wonder what's in that building." And as being a reporter, you have a way to find out. It's so cool. It's wonderful. But as a career, I don't know where it's going or how to build it. So if people are interested, youngster, somebody in college or somebody wants to go into it, I say absolutely go into it. It's a blast. You will learn many skills that are soft skills, they call them, how to charm people, how to put up with people you don't like if you still want to have information from them, how to find out the person you want to like, how to organize your thoughts and all that kind of stuff. That is incredibly valuable in many fields. Just don't think that if the time comes that you suddenly think someday you want to buy a house or, raise a kid, this may not be the field to work in. But by then you will have already had a lot of fun. You've gotten to sit in a murder trial. None of your friends have sat in a murder trial, and you have. So things like that. It's a lot of fun. So absolutely go into it. Just realize that, when you're 35, you may not still be in it, which is fine.
I think that's good advice. Any new projects or anything new that you want to share with us about stuff that you're working on?
I don't usually look that far ahead of what I'm going to do. In fact, we have a Monday morning meeting, So one of the things that COVID has done is now I work from home most of the time, which is great. Has its drawbacks. It means I stumble on fewer stories just wandering around because I'm not here wandering around as much. So there are some journalistic drawbacks. But anyway, so most of our meetings are actually over group phone. Excuse me. And we have a Monday morning one that says, "Hey, what are you doing this week?" And my answer is always, "I don't know. I got some vague thoughts, but I don't know. I haven't talked to anybody to see who's going to be around and what's going on." I mean, so at the moment I was looking at enrollment data as to whether there's any interesting trends we can talk about. There's a webinar next week on people who own private wells, and I'm actually going to write an advance on it just so people will know maybe to think about their well, because about a third of New Hampshire gets their water from a private well, including me. And a lot of times people sort of forget about it and it goes bad. So that's sort of a minor thing. I'm hoping to talk to folks about the realities of electric school buses. So there's some grants that came out, and there's a few school districts in New Hampshire getting electric school buses, which electric school buses are awesome. They are a terrific technology, but you got to be ready to use them. So I hope to be talking about the realities of how to set up your network so you can take advantage of them, and whether you can do vehicle grid and get some money that way. So there's a lot of stuff like that, but I don't have any major, earth-shaking projects in mind. I sort of let things come my way as they do, and usually that means in late December when everything slows down, I'm scrambling to find stuff to write about.
Well, that all sounds pretty good to me as someone who has a private well and who puts his kid on a school bus every day. I'll look forward to seeing those columns.
Wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to inhale those fumes while you're waiting for your kid to get up on the, go through the door?
Yeah, well, they're not. They're a lot. They're not as stinky as they used to be. But yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, definitely. So.
Well, thank you so much, David. It was really a lot of fun to talk with you today, and you showed that you've picked up a lot of that charm that you talked about earlier, because I think you charmed us today, and we appreciate your time.
I'm always happy to talk about myself. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot.
The Granite Beat is a project of the Granite State News Collaborative in partnership with the Laconia Daily Sun. We record at the Lakeport Opera House, and our theme music is composed by Bob McCarthy. Thanks also to the Marlin Fitzwater Center at Franklin Pierce University for editing and other support.